Before we get underway today, I would ask you to join in a moment of silence for the victims of yesterday's bombings in Boston, for those who died, those who were injured, and their families and loved ones. Amen. Good afternoon. I'm Bill Shambra, Director of Hudson's Bradley Center for Philanthropy and Civic Renewal. Kristen McIntyre and I welcome you to today's panel discussion entitled The Charitable Tax Deduction and the American Political Order. That might seem to be a somewhat grandiose title and an audaciously big leap, moving from a particular provision of the American tax code on the one hand, all the way down to the question of what sort of political order we Americans have established and wish to preserve on the other. Yet that sort of grand connection is one of the exciting, if daunting, intellectual possibilities prompted by today's debate about the charitable tax deduction. Perhaps as never before, threats to it of the most fundamental kind have arisen, demanding from us the most thoughtful and thoroughgoing conversation about it. And it's significant that those threats don't track the usual ideological divisions. They've arisen from all points of the political spectrum. Not only has President Obama returned repeatedly to his proposal to reduce the deduction, but during the presidential campaign of 2012, Republican candidate Mitt Romney proposed a cap on deductions that would surely have fallen with particular severity on the charitable deduction. And as Congress now mulls comprehensive tax reform over the coming year, the fate of that deduction becomes even more uncertain. As trying and painful as this sort of threat is, it nonetheless compels us, perhaps for the first time, to probe the deduction's deepest meaning. That is, the crisis forces us to get beyond some of the more superficial questions we typically ask about it. Does it stimulate giving? Is it an efficient way to promote public outcomes and so forth, in order to ask the largest questions we can pose. Is it just a provision of the tax code, or is it somehow fundamentally a reflection and reinforcement of the American character? Is it rooted in the very definition of the good society as we understand it? Would its radical limitation or alteration deal a blow to our understanding of the good and free society? Not many scholars and commentators on the deduction ever reach that level of reflection, but we're fortunate enough to have with us today several who have. It was my honor to be asked by Sandra Swirsky to moderate a panel discussion at last year's Philanthropy Roundtable annual meeting, where I first encountered Alex Reid's argument for the deduction. Alex is of counsel at Morgan Lewis's tax practice and former counsel on the Hill for the Joint Committee on Taxation. We'll hear first from Alex this morning. We'll then hear from Rob Reich, a Stanford political scientist and author of another article we made assigned reading for this session, and the title of which, Toward a Political Theory of Philanthropy, suggests accurately that he too goes to the deepest questions beneath the charitable deduction and is able to write titles every bit as grandiose as ours. Finally, we'll hear from, and he'll deny that he wrote it, of course. He'll say that the magazine or the book came up with the title, I'm sure. And finally, we'll hear from the Princeton historian who introduced me to Rob's article, Stanley Katz, an article that Professor Katz wrote with Barry Carl for the journal Minerva in 1981, entitled The American Private Philanthropic Foundation and the Public Sphere. Remains one of the classics of scholarship on the relationship between philanthropy and the American political order. So, Alex.
Great.
You can either speak from there or come up to the podium.
Oh, I think I'll just speak from here. Let's see if we can boot up the PowerPoint. Okay, so what is the purpose of the charitable deduction in the American political tradition? the question gets to the heart of an extremely important and often overlooked issue, which is that the charitable tax deduction is more than just a provision of tax law. The charitable deduction helps to define the relationship between American citizens and the state. The central question is this: is the charitable deduction a government subsidy of charitable activity, or does the charitable deduction implement a policy of government neutrality to allow Americans to make their own decisions on how to contribute to the public benefit? I believe the charitable deduction should be understood as implementing a policy of government neutrality rather than of government subsidy, because neutrality is consistent with the American value of self-reliance. Subsidy, on the other hand, necessarily involves government control over some of the most basic American freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly. As I will demonstrate, the policy of government neutrality is supported by fundamental principles of economics, and subsidy theory is an illusion created by an excessively narrow focus on taxation. I'm going to define charity using the terminology of economics. Very simply, charity is activity whose purpose is to generate public benefit without significant private benefit. I believe this definition of charity as public benefit without private benefit captures the notion of broad participation in the marketplace of ideas about how to improve society that is fundamental to the American way of life. Another word for activity in the philanthropic marketplace is civic engagement, participation in your community and in the conversation about how to make society better. And another word for charities is civil society, because charities are the entities to which we contribute and through which we engage in society. Again, it's important to remember that charities must engage in public benefit without significant private benefit. So charities are the segment of civil society that provides public benefits without substantial private benefit. I recognize that there are some parts of civil society that may provide public benefit, but also which have significant private benefit. So, for example, labor unions and chambers of commerce may provide some public benefits, but they also provide a lot of private benefits to their members. And so there are special tax rules that deal with those organizations. So you can segment civil society, but charities are the part that deliver the public benefit with as little private benefit as possible. Every charity begins with a gift. It's through gifts that we create, fund, and operate these organizations that make up American civil society. Civil society is the space outside of government, outside of business and the family, and it's one of the foundations of American civilization. So in this image, you see the pillars of American civilization, and civil society is one of them. At its core, civil society is about self-reliance. It's about ordinary people gathering together to provide for the common good by helping the needy, healing the sick, teaching the ignorant, and worshiping as they choose. Before there's government, there's charity. Alexis de Tocqueville observed that this is America's most important feature. The self-reliance of American civil society is what gives birth to American democracy. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Civil society is about variety. This is a scattergram I made by using information from the National Center on Charitable Statistics, which provides a taxonomy of civil society. So you can see civil society is made up of churches and schools and arts organizations. It's homeless shelters, it's disaster relief organizations, it's medical organizations, civil rights, sports leagues, veterans associations. It's a list as varied and diverse as America is itself. Civil society is about public benefit. We all benefit from the work of civil society. Educational organizations provide businesses with an educated workforce and democracy with an educated electorate. Religious, ethnic, and cultural organizations knit together communities with a common identity. And charitable organizations help all of us when disaster strikes. As I said yesterday, if you heard, Superstorm Sandy was an example of where it hit a community in New York that felt it was very well established and middle class, and suddenly they found themselves, knocking on the door of the Red Cross and the Salvation Army because they were flooded out of their homes and had nowhere else to turn. Volunteer organizations provide public benefits by giving us a sense of purpose. So civil society is about democracy, and it does not require sovereign permission. Sovereign control over civil society is one of the reasons our founding fathers fled from Europe and came to America during the colonial period. Unlike the old world, in America, each of us has the right to envision what is in the public interest. We also have the right to put our money where our mouth is by making charitable contributions. So control over civil society is a big theme here, and you'll see in a minute how the charitable deduction plays into that and prevents it. There's a delicate balance between government and civil society. As we've just seen, charity, the charitable component of civil society, leads to civic engagement. Civic engagement leads to democracy. Democracy leads to government. And the question is, how ultimately should the government behave toward civil society? Should it subsidize it, or should it remain neutral toward it? All right, this is where the charitable deduction comes in. The charitable deduction removes gifts, charitable gifts, from the tax base. This makes sense from a tax policy perspective because the charity consumes the gift rather than the donor. So it does not make sense to tax the donor on the gift. In this image, the cake is the tax base, and when we give a piece to charity, the cake gets a little bit smaller. The purpose of the charitable deduction is to form a boundary between the state and civil society. The charitable deduction does two things. One, it protects civil society from government crowd-out through misguided efforts to expand the tax base like we're witnessing today. And two, it protects civil society from government control. You can see why the boundary is important from this chart, which shows U.S. tax rates over the history of the income tax. As you can see, there have been times, such as in World War I and World War II, when the government's need for revenue was so extreme that tax rates hit 77% and 94%. Did they sacrifice the charitable deduction to pay for those wars? No, they did not. In fact, it was the need to pay for World War I that inspired Congress to enact the charitable deduction in the first place. After all, they reasoned, there would be little point in fighting a war to defend the American way of life, only to turn around and sacrifice the very thing that defines us as a nation. Here's what they said. This is from the congressional record. The time may come when the government will have to choose between national defense on the one hand and the continuance of educational and philanthropic institutions. We may have to turn our schools and hospitals and playgrounds into battleships and ammunition. But that time has not yet come, even in France, which of course was further along in World War I than America was at that time. So the charitable deduction prevents the government from consuming civil society through taxation. Pardon the funny image, but remember the cake we talked about earlier. This is what would happen to that piece that's supposed to go to charity if we don't do something about it, right? It also enables civil society to fund itself, which prevents government control. It restricts the relationship between the church and state. As the Supreme Court observed in the case of Waltz v. Commissioner, if the government were to tax churches, the government would have to obtain a great deal of information about the church and really get into their business. That would create a real problem from a constitutional perspective, which is why the court understood the income tax exemption of churches as a mechanism for disentangling the government and churches rather than as a mechanism of subsidizing churches. So I believe we need a paradigm shift in the way we talk about the charitable deduction. As specialists, we tend to think of the charitable deduction too narrowly, like the blind man and the elephant. Each of us has our own view on why the deduction is important and what it does, but we tend to miss the big picture. I'm glad that philosophers and historians and other social scientists are joining the conversation rather than leaving it just to the tax community, because we could use a broader perspective. One consequence of removing charitable gifts from the tax base is that the after-tax cost of giving goes down. This is a point that tax lawyers love to make because we're always looking for ways to save our clients money. But we have to be careful here. The charitable deduction is a tax rule, and the tax consequences are of course important, but its purpose is deeper than that. Economists have a similar narrowness because they look at the microeconomic incentives that lowering the after-tax cost of giving produces. Yes, the incentive to give is important, but it is also just the tail on the elephant. We need to change the paradigm. Incentive and subsidy are the wrong tools for understanding the charitable deduction. It's like trying to pound in a screw with a hammer. You can get there, but it's not very elegant. We need to start talking about the charitable deduction as a means of ensuring government neutrality toward civil society. Here's one thing that's wrong with thinking about the charitable deduction as a government subsidy. Subsidy is inconsistent with freedom. I'll demonstrate this through a simple logical syllogism that leads to a result that's not one that you would accept. As you may know, under current law, the government may restrict how government funds are used. In other words, when you take government money, the government can tell you what to do with the money. A government subsidy involves the use of government funds. So when the government gives you a subsidy, that is economically equivalent to giving you the money directly. So if the charitable deduction is a subsidy, then the government can control an organization that receives the money from a donor who claimed a tax deduction. That can't be right as a constitutional matter because the whole point of America is that our government cannot control civil society. So if something smells fishy to you, it's the subsidy paradigm. We've been through this all before. Back in 1819, shortly after the founding of America, the state of New Hampshire tried to seize control of Dartmouth College, which is a private institution and part of American civil society. The government's argument was this: when the donor made the gift to found Dartmouth College and educate the Native Americans of New Hampshire, the donor was really making a gift to the people, right? The public benefit purpose of education was a gift to the people. The government, as the people's representative, therefore had the right to control the gift. In fact, what was going on was that the Jeffersonians won the election, and they wanted to replace the trustees of Dartmouth, who were Federalists, with loyal Jeffersonians. So the Supreme Court looked at this argument that the government, as the people's representative, should have the right to control gifts for the public interest, and it said no. The Jeffersonians argued, the king is gone, tyranny is over, we're in a democracy, you have nothing to fear from a democratically elected government. And the Supreme Court said that's absolutely false, there should be a boundary separating government from civil society. Even in a democracy, the government does not have the right to control gifts for the public benefit. Okay, fast forward 200 years to today, and we're back in the same place. The argument today is that the charitable deduction is a subsidy, which makes it a gift from the government. As the benefactor, the government can control its gifts, money that it has given. So subsidy theory is wrong because it turns the charitable deduction into the government's Trojan horse, right? A Trojan horse is a gift that conceals soldiers inside. So when you accept the gift, you also accept the control. So this is the reason we need to reject the subsidy paradigm, is because it turns every gift into a vehicle for government control over the gift recipient. The other problem, of course, with the subsidy paradigm is that the government is under no obligation to provide or continue a subsidy. It can simply turn off the spigot if it finds that it has a better use for the money. This is what Daniel Webster said when he argued the Dartmouth College case, and his words moved the Supreme Court to tears. He said, "Shall our state legislature be allowed to take that which is not their own, to turn it from its original use, and apply it to such ends or purposes as they, in their discretion, shall see fit? Sir, you may destroy this little institution. It is weak. It is in your hands. You may put it out. But if you do, you must carry on with your work and extinguish one after another all those great lights of science which for more than a century have thrown their radiance over the land. It is, sir, as I have said, a small college, and yet there are those who love it, right? This is to this day, Dartmouth College graduates, this is their rallying cry. All right, so turning now to the economics of the charitable deduction, this is the last segment. Economic income excludes payments for public benefit. Payment for activities that generate a public benefit decrease the economic income of the payor, so it is appropriate to exclude such payments from the tax base. Here's the equation. This is the E equals MC squared, the fundamental equation of tax law. It was invented by Haig-Simons. It says income equals consumption plus a change in net worth. Consumption is a measure of private benefit. Payments that create public benefit do not increase economic income. So when people say that charitable contributions are consumption, what they're really saying is that 100% of a charitable contribution is private benefit, that there's no public benefit at all in that charitable contribution. So this cannot be correct as a mathematical proposition. Sometimes you hear it said that the power to dispose of property under donor control is consumption. This is also incorrect as a mathematical proposition. The mathematical equality of economic income as being equal to consumption plus a change in net worth, that equality would not hold if you were to redefine consumption as a disposition of property rather than the consumption for private benefit. Because logically, it must be possible to make a transfer that is for public benefit and not for private benefit. The tax law requires charities to be organized and operated to perform a public benefit, and it has many rules to screen out private benefit. For example, 501c3 requires organizations to serve a broad and indeterminate class of beneficiaries. It forbids organizations from distributing profits to insiders, right? It prevents an organization from engaging in excessive lobbying or political campaign intervention, which are both forms of private benefit activities. And it requires organizations not to operate contrary to public policy, right? If you're operating contrary to public policy, you can't be providing public benefit. Also, 501c3s must not engage in self-dealing or excess benefit transactions. So that's another way of preventing private benefit. The charitable contribution deduction has a similar set of rules that require a public benefit and screen out private benefit. So to qualify for a deduction, the contribution must be received by a domestic charitable organization that's organized and operated to deliver public benefits. It has to be used for a public benefit purpose, and if the donor receives anything of value in exchange for the contribution, any money, property, services, cash, that quid pro quo the donor receives reduces the value of the charitable contribution. The tax law definition of charity is very broad, which makes sense. Basically, the tax law provides rough outlines of activities that qualify as providing a public benefit in each category: educational, religious, charitable, etc. This looseness in the definition should not be viewed as a bad thing because it engenders the sort of dynamism about civic engagement that's extremely important for American society. As we've just seen, a self-defining civil society does not harm the fisc, which is to say the government's pocketbook, because payments for public benefit are not economic income and should not be taxed. Therefore, the government has every reason to be neutral towards civil society. So to sum up, charity is about civil society. Civil society is fundamental to American civilization. Charitable contributions create public benefit. The fisc is unharmed by charitable activity. And the purpose of the charitable deduction is to implement a policy of government neutrality toward American civil society. Thank you.
I'm going to use the podium if that's okay. Well, first I want to thank Bill and Kristen for inviting me to come out and participate. It's the second time I've been at a Hudson Institute event. It was really terrific the first time, and I'm really excited to be back. Also want to thank Stan and Alex for participating in this important conversation, even though, at least out in California, a conversation about tax policy in general, charitable contributions tax policy, I think would cause eyes to glaze over amongst the students in my classes. I do my best to convey to them how significant this particular topic happens to be. I also want to offer a sort of preemptive apology to anyone in the audience who came today expecting to see the former labor secretary. Perhaps given the likely politics of some of you in the room, it's more of a pleasant surprise than a disappointment. But in an effort to compensate, I brought some gifts. I think passed out for all of you on your seat was a copy of a magazine called the Boston Review, which contains a cover story that I wrote on the topic of big philanthropy and whether it supports or is inconsistent with intention with democracy. The title of the piece is What Are Foundations For? Stan is one of the commentators. Boston Review has a nice format in that they invite responses to the initial piece in the magazine. I think there are some other folks in the room who also made some responses. If Pablo Eisenberg is here, or Rick Cohen I see in the back of the room. Zoltan Atz might be here as well, and his colleagues. Zoltan here I haven't met before, but Tyler Cowan and Christopher Coyne also made some contributions. In addition, you should have a little coupon on your seat for a magazine that comes out of a shop that I run at Stanford called the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. The Stanford Social Innovation Review is something that might interest you there. So that's my way to compensate for disappointment if you were expecting the former labor secretary. I mentioned the Boston Review piece because that's, in certain respects, the same orientation I want to bring to my comments about this particular topic. I think the happy ambition of our panel discussion today is to try to get beyond the day-to-day or month-to-month politics of the charitable tax deduction and explore its deeper dimensions. And I come as an outsider to an inside the Beltway debate. I'm by training a political philosopher, and my views about philanthropy are decidedly not shaped by practical or strategic considerations about how to prevail in the current budgetary debates, about how to represent the interests of the foundation community or of the nonprofit community. I'm interested instead in what I hope you'll take as a sincere attempt to get at first principles. I'm interested in the role that charity, that nonprofit organizations, that foundations, or that civil society as a general matter, plays in a well-functioning democracy. And the question which I posed in the Boston Review article, what are foundations for, attempts to start off from a perspective something like the following. Suppose you were the founding fathers and mothers to update the language, and you were attempting to build a democratic society from scratch. Would you create the institutional form of a foundation because you thought it was absolutely essential from the beginning point of the democratic society to create such an institution? In similar form, I want you to imagine that our task now in creating a liberal democratic society is to wonder what the appropriate public policy framework ought to be for thinking about individual charitable contributions. So I think I meet Alex and anticipate Stan's comments as well in trying to imagine this as a really ground-level exploration about the role of charitable contributions, nonprofit organizations, and their status within a democratic society. So in really simplified form, what I want you to imagine is the following. I would want to suggest that a good way to begin such a conversation at the level of first principle is to say, let's imagine that we're setting up a liberal democracy. We have some garden variety features, some standard arrangements of a liberal democracy, a limited government where we insist upon very strong protections for individual liberty. Secondly, let's get up and running some system of private property. So we've got strong protections for individual liberty. We've got a system of private property. Next, install your preferred tax system. Whatever system of taxation you think is consistent with the broader principles of what an appropriate democratic society ought to have, get that up and running. Now, if you're a left-leaning sort of social democrat, you might want a very robust tax system that provides a strong social safety net. You know the conventional stories here. If you're an arch-libertarian, you may think that the only thing worth taxing people for is the enforcement of contracts and perhaps the provision of national defense. whatever it turns out to be, get up and running your preferred tax system. Strong individual liberty, some system of private property, and then a tax system. Now, what I want to suppose is that since the actual behavior of philanthropic activity, giving away one's money, time, or property, is something that's as old as humanity, this should come to the attention of any political philosopher as a really important question to consider. And if we have these standard arrangements of a liberal democratic society, strong liberty, private property, and whatever tax system you think is appropriate, now imagine any particular individual has a bunch of stuff, property, money, material. They have the liberty to dispose of their stuff as they wish. That's part of what happens with private property. And they've been taxed in whatever way we've already pre-conceded is appropriate, consistent with your view. Now they wish to give some money away for some public benefit. They wish to behave charitably, to adopt the definition that Alex gave us. My simple question is, what attitude should the liberal democratic state have towards the individual preference of people to give money away for some public purpose, to behave charitably? My view is that there are only three options in the liberal democratic state about how to answer that question. Someone wishes to behave charitably. There are three possibilities that present itself to us. The first option is, well, we've got individual liberty, we're committed to limited government, we've got a regime of private property, and we've been taxed already in whatever way we accepted in the first principle. So if someone wants to give money away, it's their stuff. The appropriate attitude of the state is complete non-interference. We don't get in the way of the person to give their money away. If they wish to bury it in the backyard, they want to consume it in form of private consumption, they want to give it away for public benefit. That's what it means to honor individual liberty, to allow people to do with their stuff what they want. So the state stays out of their way. That's the first option. Second option, we might have some powerful reasons in a liberal democracy to constrain, or perhaps even in certain instances, to forbid the exercise of liberty of people to give money away for some public benefit. So we can attempt to curtail what we agree is the liberty that people might, as a default matter, possess. Why might we curtail it? Well, we'd have to have some very powerful arguments. There would be a justification that a democratic society would have to offer to limit the liberty of people to give money away. And in fact, we do have such justification on certain circumstances. So for instance, in the form of campaign finance contributions, less so in the wake of Citizens United, but even still, if you're donating directly to an electioneering campaign for a particular candidate, even though we say to individual citizens, we, the democratic society, say, we recognize that the money in your back pocket is yours, you still may not give away more than whatever sum to this particular candidate because we don't want democracy to depend, or its outcomes to depend, on the size of people's wallets as much as the equal opportunity for them to exercise political influence, or some story like that. Similarly with estate taxation, if you thought that some notion of intergenerational equality of opportunity was an essential component of a democratic society to exist over the course of time, you might well think that there are some good reasons to impose estate taxation to prevent the creation of castes over the course of generations. So we might have some arguments on occasion to limit the liberty of people to give money away. That's the second possibility. A third option would be, let's subsidize the liberty of people to give money away. Let's give them a reason to exercise a liberty which they already have in order to make a charitable contribution. Now, contrary to Alex, this is the option that I think correctly describes the system we have right now in the United States, a tax deduction to provide a subsidy for the exercise of a liberty that people already possess. I think that actually accords better with the historical record as well, since of course the tax deduction for charitable giving is just shy now of 100 years old, and we've seen charitable behavior in the U.S. and of course in all of humanity across time. But I want to begin from that starting presupposition. Option 3 would be, let's subsidize the liberty to give money away. What possible justification could we give for that? Because that constitutes, as I think Alex might also accept, an intervention in the otherwise naturally occurring liberty that people would have. Why should we, as a democratic people, constrain the liberty of people to give money away? Why should we subsidize the liberty of people to give money away? Why not just stay out of their way to let them exercise the liberty that in the liberal democratic state you might think that they ought to possess, do possess? Now, in my remarks, I want to focus just on what possible justifications you might offer for providing a subsidy, which is to get at the heart of the question that Bill has set for us, get to the deepest foundations of the charitable contributions deduction. I have only limited time, so I'm going to make the barest gestures at some arguments and hope for further follow-up and discussion. So the first possible justification is, I think, the one that Alex favors, and it's the justification that denies that there is a subsidy at all. It would be called what I think is the tax-based rationale. The idea is that when we make an assessment of what someone's taxable income ought to be, we always and everywhere ought to exempt people's charitable contributions from taxation. And therefore, we don't ask further questions about whether it's a subsidy. It's just the appropriate, philosophically appropriate, normatively appropriate way to treat income. We exempt charitable contributions. Now, I think there are a variety of problems with this. I'll mention just two of them for the moment. I think both of these apply as criticisms now to Alex's argument. Number one, Alex suggested that charitable contributions create public benefits with no private benefit. And of course, they do create public benefits, but the idea that charitable contributions as they actually exist in the world in which we all know never creates or only creates a minor or a small private benefit seems to me willful delusion, to be honest. Well, first of all, the idea would be people receive what economists have described as a warm glow from their giving. So they consume a warm glow when they behave altruistically. Now, you may think that's not something that should be appropriately taxed. You might be right. Maybe it's not appropriate to call it consumption. This is the way that economists tend to model it, so I'm just reporting from the economic sphere of the way they think about it. Secondly, and I think more significantly, although it's true that certain organizations do eliminate from your tax-deductible gift certain actual benefits that you receive. If you take the mug from the Parks Foundation, you'll get, you don't get $20 of your otherwise $100 deductible gift. But there are many, many other ways in which charity is a form of private consumption. It's a form of social status signaling, of social climbing. It's a form of purchasing for oneself the existence of one's name in perpetuity by attaching it to a building. My university is filled with such examples. You could go on and on. Now, of course, it's not true that every form of charitable giving has a robust form of private consumption, but the idea that Alex suggested that private consumption is never a part, private benefit is never a part of charitable contributions, again, seems to me willfully ignorant of the actually existing facts on the ground. That's actually, I think, a trivial matter. I think the more fundamental matter, the fundamental problem with the tax base argument, is that it treats the tax base as a sort of philosophically significant problem in itself. It's as if we get up and running whatever the system of taxation is, and then we ask ourselves, well, what's the fair way to tax people? Should we exempt charitable contributions or not? I think that's a misguided way of approaching what taxation is. Taxation is just an instrument of realizing whatever larger social aims one has in a democratic society. So taxation is not a question we can ask what's fair or unfair just within the tax code. We can only assess fairness in taxation by reference to the larger social aims, which are the underpinning of whatever theory of justice or theory of political philosophy we might have about a democratic society. So we can only begin to wonder whether or not the income that we have, that we say is ours, is appropriately taxed or not appropriate taxed by asking some larger questions about the kind of society in which we live in and the kind of society we want to live in. To put this in, I guess, the bluntest way possible, democratic societies are societies of mutual cooperation in which we create interconnected webs of institutional infrastructure in order to pursue our own private aims, where whatever income we happen to acquire for ourselves within this system of mutual cooperation doesn't exist as some pre-political, pre-institutional, naturally occurring private property. It's something that only is permissible, I don't mean permissible in the legal sense, but possible to accumulate in the cooperation within a society of mutual cooperation. So that when we define the terms of that mutual cooperation and we include some system of taxation as the way to set it up, we have to have reference to these larger purposes, not confine it just with the tax code. So I reject the idea that a tax-based argument could ever provide us a good reason to exempt from possible taxation any charitable contributions. That leaves two other possible arguments in defense of the charitable contributions deduction or some type of incentive. I'll mention these just very briefly, and I'll say something about the second of the two as the one I defend, I myself am partial to. So the second argument, I just want to give the very generic description of a subsidy rationale to. This would be to defend what it is that Alex has attempted to reject, that the tax deduction for charitable giving is in fact a subsidy to try to stimulate certain forms of behavior that might otherwise not happen as frequently as possible, maybe not happen at all, or that the government wants to happen more frequently than it would in the absence of the subsidy. And when we announce something or describe something as a subsidy rationale in this respect, what we look at, I think this is the standard tax lawyer or economist point of view, we look at the benefits that are kicked out from the behavior that we see at the cost to the Treasury of the lost tax revenue. So the key question to assess whether or not the subsidy rationale is defensible, is justifiable, would be to ask what I think you could call a question of Treasury efficiency. For the loss of tax revenue, last year, according to Alex, I think the amount was something on the order of $40 billion lost from the Treasury in foregone tax revenue in the form of the subsidy for charitable giving. For the loss of the $40 billion of revenue, do we gain something in social or public benefit in excess of the $40 billion? If the answer to that question is yes, then it's Treasury efficient. And we can begin to assess whether or not the distributional patterns we see in charitable behavior are things that are worth the $40 billion in lost tax revenue. Now, given the kaleidoscopic inclusivity of the United States nonprofit sector, the 501c3 hyper-permissive inclusionary attitude, I happen to think that calling attention to the distributional public benefits in civil society at the cost of $40 billion to tax revenue leads to some interesting questions about whether or not the Treasury efficiency works out. I'll refer to the studies of economists as a way to assess that more precisely. I'll just announce it as I think it's the appropriate justification, the appropriate way to decide whether or not to justify it with a subsidy rationale. Rather than the subsidy rationale, I am partial to what I'll describe now as a pluralism rationale. And the pluralism rationale, I think, has some elements of what Alex described. The pluralism rationale would run like the following. It's still a subsidy. We're still trying to provide certain types of benefits for the public, for society, at the cost of some tax revenue. But rather than focusing on what are the outcomes within civil society, what's the array of nonprofit organizations and the benefits that they provide, the pluralism rationale focuses instead on the voice of the individual citizen rather than on the benefit of the nonprofit organizations provided, on the outputs of the nonprofit organizations. Pluralism rationale says, similar to what I think Alex believes, that the existence of a diverse, flourishing civil society within a democracy in which the preferences of all citizens about the scope of the kinds of benefits that they want to provide collectively and the kinds of things they want perhaps in the future to speak to government about ought to be a realm in which the individual liberties of people are protected robustly and the voices of citizens are cast energetically into that realm of civil society. It might be the case, in fact, this is the argument I'm partial to, that decentralizing the power to produce public goods, where we rest much of that power in the state, in the form of taxation, and then our elected representatives to disperse that tax income, but we decentralize some of that power through the tax deduction, providing a subsidy, not to look at the outcomes or the outputs of nonprofit organizations, but to enhance the voices of individual citizens, to encourage the pluralism and diversity of civil society, is not merely a permissible thing for government to do, but an important and perhaps even necessary thing for a democratic society to do. It focuses not on the outcomes of nonprofit organizations, it focuses on the voices of individual citizens. If you are partial, if I've tugged on some intuition in you that makes you feel, maybe that's not such a bad idea, then the current form of the incentive, the tax deduction, is all wrong, because it has a variety of perverse features that provide, rather than a democratic voice of all citizens, provides for a plutocratic voice for people in the form of the incentive, and gives the voices of wealthy people far more representation in the pluralism and diversity of civil society than would be the case if the structure of the incentive were different. So, I want to conclude just by saying that I think my default presupposition is that it ought to be a very heavy burden for someone to suggest something other than what's the attitude of a liberal democratic state towards the individual preference of someone to give money away. Default presupposition ought to be, well, private property, individual liberty, you've been taxed already? Have at it. Give money away on your own dime. That's championing civil society. That's championing the idea of people being altruistic or charitable or philanthropic for their own reasons. Of course, that's the system we've had up to 1917. What argument could you give on behalf of a subsidy for exercising a liberty which people already possess? My candidate for such an argument, if there is one, is the pluralism rationale. Thanks.
Well, I want to thank Bill and everyone here for coming. Excuse me. My role here is to simply be the historical conscience of this conversation, and I'm going to focus mainly on what Alex has had to say. My own views are actually normatively quite close to Rob's, and in any case, I've got an essay in the magazine he's given you, so you can see what I have to say about that. But I think that there's a real problem in carrying on discussions of charity or philanthropy in a sort of normative, totally normative environment, because we don't live in a totally normative environment. We live in the real world, and we live in a world that has been very much shaped by historical contingency. And I think recognizing that forces us to recognize also some of the sort of truths and realities about the system which we have created. And let me start by an observation Rob makes at the very beginning of his article, where he says, philanthropy is not an invention of the state, but ought to be viewed today as an artifact of the state. We can be certain that philanthropy would not have the form it currently does in the absence of the various laws that structure it and tax incentives that encourage it. And that's clearly correct, refers back to the 1917 and subsequent legislation there. But it's important to remind ourselves that it really is a modern situation in which we find ourselves. And I use as an example here the Rockefeller family. When the Rockefeller family, John D. Rockefeller Sr. and his son, first started thinking seriously about going into what we would today call philanthropy, as opposed to the charity, which they distinguish sharply from philanthropy, throughout the earlier life of John D. Rockefeller Sr., they began to think about what vehicles they might have for giving away larger sums of money in order to achieve very particular kinds of purposes. Charity for them, as it was for most of the early philanthropists, was simply the alleviation of individual cases of distress, illness, ignorance, poverty. Philanthropy was the organized attempt to do away with those problems at the root by investigating the root causes of the problems themselves. They thought this was the most important use of large-scale giving. It was very different from charity for them. So in order to think through the realities of all this, they had a quite capable lawyer named Starr Murphy, and they asked Mr. Murphy to do the following thing. Look at the tax laws of the various states. There was no federal income taxation at this point, and tell us in which state we ought to organize our charity, whatever form it will take. And it turned out to be the Philanthropic Foundation, so that we might get tax advantages for putting it in such a place. Mr. Murphy did look at that. The document exists in Pecanico in the Rockefeller archives, and he concluded that it really didn't matter what state they were in, because levels of income taxation were so low, on average 1% or less, the taxation was not a policy consideration for their philanthropy. And some of you will know the story. After that, they decided to go national, and in fact to seek a congressional charter. Philanthropy would have been very different if they had gotten that, because they were willing, in order to get a congressional charter, to bargain away the idea that the foundation would be a perpetuity, to accept a time-limited foundation, to accept publicly appointed trustees to supervise the donations they would make and so forth, but they weren't able to sell it on the Hill. So point one is simply that large-scale philanthropy is a pre-tax phenomenon, wasn't driven at all by considerations of income tax. And indeed, several of the largest foundations were already in existence by 1917, before the amendment and also before the 1917 statute. So I think that's the starting point in thinking about all of it. Although, of course, there had long been in this country fear of not so much a governmental influence, but federal governmental influence on the practice of charity. And the most famous statement here is by a president you've almost certainly forgotten about, Franklin Pierce. Remember Franklin Pierce? Franklin Pierce made a famous statement in the 1840s opposing federal action that would take the form of supporting charity in the states, on the grounds that it would, in his words, I think, dry up charity at the well springs. So there is that element in the equation also. It's been there for a long time. But I sometimes feel, when I look at the way language is used here, and it really is in Alex's piece, that I've suddenly entered Alice in Wonderland. These are all words I recognized, terms that I thought I knew, but they're used in an entirely different way that is different from an historical point of view. And that's really what I want to focus on just for a few minutes. I mean, I understand the argument that Alex is making, and I think it's a sort of reasonable normative position, not a normative position I hold, but it's not a descriptive position, and it's not a position I think that one can sustain historically. And that's worth thinking about. It's mainly an argument about the role of civil society. I happen to teach undergraduates about civil society. It's a concept I really care a lot about, but I don't understand it in the way that Alex does. Alex sees civil society as something in opposition to government, as something that needs to be protected from government, and that's why the idea of neutrality is so important to him. But it isn't the way either the concept has developed over the years or the way I think that we ordinarily use it. After all, in this country, and Rob made the point obliquely, our general policy about charitable organizations is that we permit Americans to form virtually any kind of charitable organization they prefer, so long as it doesn't explicitly violate public policy. And what we normally mean by public policy is pretty narrow. We mean the criminal law. It's more or less the case that you can set up a 501c3 organization for anything that does not violate, on the one hand, violate the criminal law or inure to your own personal benefit. And think about it for a minute. That covers a lot of territory. And of course, it's one of the things that we are proudest about in our civil society. Again, Rob spoke about the myriad forms that 501c3 organizations take in this society. It really is quite extraordinary. But on the other hand, if we're not talking about this entirely in the abstract, you have to ask yourself what Alex is really talking about on the relationship between civil society and the state. Is the state really the enemy of civil society? Is it a threat to civil society? Well, perhaps, and I can understand that in the abstract, but if you look at American history over the last, 40 years or so since the Great Society at any rate, the state is the largest single supporter of civil society. Look at the range of sources of revenue for most social serving 501c3 organizations. You'll find they're getting money from the state at one level or another, state, local, federal. We have worked out what some people in this room and others have developed as the notion of the partnership state. I think partnership is a better word for it, really. That is, state and civil society working together to achieve goals. And in fact, many of us think that that is one of the glories of the American system is that we have worked out ways for the public sector, the state sector, and the private sector in terms of the civil society sector to cooperate in important kinds of ways. And I think you wouldn't know that from reading Alex's paper, and I think he's really wrong historically about that. He says that the purpose of the charitable deduction is to ensure government neutrality towards civil society despite the imposition of the income tax. Under one paradigm, he says the state sponsors and subsidizes civil society using tax revenue. It certainly does. Under the other, individuals create civil society using their own funds without state interference. I don't think those are two separate activities, and they haven't been for a very long period of time now. So in other words, what, and Alex quotes, as everyone does, Tocqueville, what of course Tocqueville was struck by in the America he saw 150 years ago was what he called associationalism. He thought the American genius was a genius of getting together to get things done. He didn't distinguish, by the way, between government and civil activity. He gave examples that crossed that line in many ways. It wasn't a distinction that would normally have been made at that time, and I don't see, frankly, why we should make it now. And what's interesting to me, looking at the history of this, and I'm only going to say a word about it, he quotes from some of the records of the 1917 legislation. But what's most interesting about both the tax deduction and any of the subsequent limitations, particularly political limitations on charitable organization behavior, is how little the Congress has had to say about them. If you read what we have, which is very little, of the debates from 1917, I think you would conclude what my friend Nino Scalia says, which is that we ought not pay any attention to the intentions of the legislators, because you can't tell, at any rate from the record we're left, what it was they thought. And I believe that's the case with the charitable deduction. It was also, there's a long history, as Alex must know, to the charitable deduction, but it's pre-federal. The 19th century is replete with charitable deductions of various kinds, mainly the property exemption, but also special exemptions of various kinds, which were justified in a whole range of different ways. And of course, what the legislators do when the federal government finally enters this fray is to take over in, I think, a rather unexamined way what they had found in the states before. And that, to me, is the basic problem here. If you look at our constitutional arrangements, our political arrangements, from an historical point of view, the fundamental compromise that the founders of this society made was a compromise between the federal government, which, as we all know, they intended to have quite small, quite limited, possessing only the powers delegated to the federal government in the tiny little text of the Constitution, and to reserve the police power, the power over the health, safety, and welfare of the people, which is what we're talking about here, to the states and the localities within the states. That was their idea of the appropriate behavior, not of a democracy, but of a republic, which is what we were at the outset. And it's that spirit of republicanism, small r, that I think that's really key in all of this. So I would get away from the big abstractions and go back to more historical kinds of abstractions and ask what it is we actually want this sector to do, rather than to haggle about a series of highly abstract, I think quite ahistorical conceptions. The charitable deduction as it works now obviously has great advantages, and that's why it's being lobbied for so strenuously for the huge existing charitable sector that we have in this country. But it's also true, as Rob has suggested in a different context, that it's a system and it's a deduction which is massively inequitable from a political point of view. It confers, and I agree with Rob on this, it confers enormous advantages on the rich and the well-organized in this society, And if we were to worry seriously about core democratic values, I think we ought to reconsider the whole thing. Thank you.
Alex, was there anything in there that you might disagree with? Let me give you a chance to respond, but
Sure.
I should say, for those of you who have been coming here a long time, as of last session, we've gone from a 2-hour format to an hour-and-a-half format. So we're going to have some brief conversation up here, and then we'll get to our Q&A. Alex.
Okay. All right. So that was very interesting. Thank you both for your comments. I'd like to respond to Rob first, and really just point out the first logical move that Rob makes, which is very subtle and deft, and I commend you for it. But it's actually very important, which is that he rejects the idea of a normative tax, and he backs us up into a world in which you have a government, you have property rights, but you don't have an income tax. And he says, in that world, what should the government's relationship toward charities and civil society, what should it be? And I think that you can have, I agree with him, you can have in that paradigm, you could have non-interference with charities, you could subsidize charities, you could curtail liberties to give to charities. They're different approaches, but the fact is we live in a world with an income tax, and this debate is about the relationship of the government to charities in the context of an income tax. If you didn't have an income tax, you wouldn't necessarily need to subsidize charities. You wouldn't need to. There would already be a barrier between the state and civil society because people could do what they wanted, and that was the system that we had before the 16th Amendment and the income tax system. So that's quite important to point out as just a framing methodology point. On the tax-based rationale and the warm glow, I was accused of naivete. Yes, I'm aware that donors. I mean, I advise donors and charities, so I am aware that people have buildings named after themselves, and that. And
you don't think that's consumptive behavior?
Well, here's the thing. It's the tax law ignores what's called donor acknowledgement. So when the charity says thank you for the gift, in fact, the tax law requires the charity to say thank you for the gift in order for you to substantiate your charitable contribution. But the acknowledgement itself is ignored mostly for a tax administration purpose, which is that we have no idea how to value thank you. So you could, the problem is your move to say, that the donor receives a benefit from thank you. You say, aha, that's 100% consumption. There's zero private benefit. There's zero public benefit, and that's an overstating of the case. So if you were to narrow your proposal to say, the tax law should regard and reduce the value of charitable contributions by something, I challenge you to write a law that could measure accurately the thank you. You do.
Yeah, 100% public benefit with a 100% protected, no private benefit for anonymous giving to anonymous others.
Anonymous giving to anonymous others. I think it might be difficult to. I mean, there's this great Larry David Curb Your Enthusiasm sketch where they talk about a friend of his gives anonymously and tells everyone about it, and how great that is. That to be the anonymous donor is really, that's where the real private benefit comes from. So
Alex, with all
We gotta let him. Let's let Alex complete his
Okay,
thoughts,
so,
and then.
so that's kind of there's a tax administration problem there, and just warm glow in general warm glow really means private benefit, and the tax law has to look at real real things. We don't have what's called a utility tax because that would also be unadministrable, right? We could have a tax system that taxes the beachcomber who has an advanced degree at the rate of income that the beachcomber could have earned if the beachcomber were, an investment banker. But we don't do that because the beachcomber doesn't have any money to pay that tax, and we just think that would be wrong. We also don't tax you on the imputed value of the use of your home because we can't measure that. There are a lot of unadministrable things that we can't measure, we can't tax, and so to say that that's all consumption is not correct. Okay. So we talked about the normative tax base theory, and the equation that I put on the board is really, it's normative, but it's not, we can't kind of do a Foucaultian, deconstruction on that equation. It's just, it's just a kind of a law of economics that economic income equals consumption plus a change in net worth. So, to talk about a theory of social justice is fine, but when you have an income tax, you have to measure income. And so I come back to that. It's, payments for public benefit reduce economic income. It's just math. So the last point is the Treasury efficiency. What does the government get for the money? And this pluralism point, your argument that it's a good investment for the government to invest in civil society because we like pluralism. That's great. We like pluralism, but the government changes its mind and just decides on a whim that it suddenly doesn't have enough money. And then what? That's what we're seeing today. Is people kind of saying, wait a minute, we don't have the money for this. Why are we providing this subsidy? Maybe it's time to cut it back. Maybe it's time to get rid of it. And so that subsidy rationale always puts you in the posture of looking for a handout from the government, which is just a very, very deleterious position to put civil society in. So that's my response to Rob. Should I carry on and do Stan as well?
Sure, real quick like.
All right, I'll do it real quick.
And let me. So in other words, and this is that last point was very helpful because it helps me understand. So Rob's pluralism point, resting on the subsidy theory, doesn't get you to the same place that you're in because subsidy always means that government can artificially adjust the level of pluralism. That's great.
Right.
Terrific. Yeah. That's a clarifying.
Thank you for your moral support. All right. So in response to Stan, I've been accused of naivete. I hesitate to accuse you of the same, but you suggest, I have no problem with joint ventures between civil society and the government. I think it's great. I've worked in a lot of organizations that work hand in hand with the government, and they have mutual interests. They work together. I think it's a beautiful thing. I'm very happy when it happens. The problem is there are a lot of times when the government wants to crush somebody. It happens more often than not, and in fact, it's not just the government. Other citizens want to crush other aspects of civil society. Civil society is the hotbed of stuff that makes people really angry. Civil society is where you get civil rights organizations. It's where you get churches. You can't believe the schisms that people who you would think believe almost the same thing, but they fight and they write nasty letters to the IRS and they say you should revoke that guy's exempt status. I've seen it. I've been asked to do it. I try not to do that sort of thing because it's we're all in this together. But I'd say every day in the news there's a story about some organization that's fallen out of favor with the government or fallen out of favor with another group, and we need to protect that. We need to protect people's right to engage in the public benefit without interference from others. That's part of our American tradition. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Sure. Now, Rob, did you want to, incidentally, before, I was not turning his microphone off. I was actually turning it on. So did you want to take two quick minutes and then Stan, and then we'll go to Q&A
I'll
from the
just
audience?
do 1 minute. So just to be 100% clear, my argument is not that charity is actually 100% private consumption. It was a comment on what I took to be Alex's argument, which I thought was represented in the slides, that private charitable contribution, as conceptualized by you, was 100% public benefit and no personal consumptive activity. And I was simply trying to point out that descriptively, much charitable behavior has a dimension of private consumption. You then say, but the tax administration for doing that is really complicated. But I thought we were arguing at a level of higher principle, not about whether the tax lawyers or administrators could figure out how to quantify. I have no expertise there, so I'm willing to accept your argument that we may have no instrument at our disposal to quantify it. But the burden of your argument was to show there is no private consumption. I was trying to illustrate that there was some. And when you say the Larry David, I haven't seen the show, that seems to me to count in my favor. So if it even turns out to be the case that anonymous giving to anonymous others redounds to one's private advantage in certain circumstances as a consumption item to show how virtuous you are with respect to your friends, I think you make my point, not your own.
Yeah, I'll just make a very quick comment. The only thing I don't understand in your response is the state is in fact setting all the rules. And I think it's essential in a democratic society that the state should. The whole notion of a 501c3 organization is a state-imposed definition. I think unfortunately we've established it through the tax system. Most countries don't do that, and I think ours is a bad way of doing it, but we do it that way, so that we've already defined the sector through the employment of a state mechanism. And not only that, I think it's very important that the state does retain a certain level of control. As you say, the sector is very useful because it allows us to vie with one another, and we all believe that that should be possible. And I think, in fact, our record in this country of permitting the civil society to mix it up in a fairly uninhibited way is pretty good.
Okay. Yes, Scott, please. And state your name and institutional affiliation and when the microphone gets there. And please talk. The microphone is not getting there. Okay. All right. Scott, why don't you just go ahead. Scott Walter, Capital Research Center. And speak directly into it. It's kind of
Scott Walter, Capital Research Center. I found the professor's presentation somewhat unsatisfactory. The first began with philosophy, but doesn't seem to have a clear notion of philosophy before John Rawls. And the second spoke about history and doesn't seem to have an idea of history before about 1960. And I wanted to challenge one of those claims in the history side, and that is that Tocqueville didn't really distinguish between government and private associations and civil society. The very chapter of the use which Americans make of associations in public life explicitly says these are not associations for political purposes, and has the famous distinction that in France, where you see the government running something, and in England you see a nobleman running something, in America you see an association. And he thought this was a very nice development in history that needed to be replicated elsewhere. And then on the last point, again as a historical issue in Tocqueville, yes, we would agree, historically speaking, since the 1960s, the centralized government has indeed subsumed or started to subsume the civil society under itself. But of course, Tocqueville predicted that in the climax of Democracy in America, where he made it a nightmare, called it the new sort of despotism that democracies have to fear, and again, explicitly said this would be done by the government if it were to happen. So as I said, I find those both rather unsatisfactory.
I don't think this is the place to debate Tocqueville, although I'm willing to do it.
Oh, this is exactly the place to debate. I mean, this is what we do all the time.
Tocqueville, of course, has a chapter on political associations. He thought the concept worked equally well for political associations. He certainly did understand that there was a difference, but he thought, I think, that there was an organic relationship between those two, and what he liked in this country was that that seemed to work much better. Obviously, that didn't work in France. But and by the way, I didn't say, and I don't believe, that the state consumed civil society after 1960. On the contrary, I think the relations between the state and civil society are better since 1960. And I don't think Tocqueville was making predictions about what 21st century government would be. I don't think he's very useful for doing that, as a matter of fact. The key element for me is his emphasis on associationalism. I think he's right, that that's something we have a real talent for and a propensity for. And I think what's remarkable in our history is the way over the last 100 years or so, the state has found a way both to protect and to facilitate that.
The other interesting thing about Tocqueville, as I say, that it's never inappropriate to refer to Tocqueville in our panels here, is his interesting understanding of self-interest properly understood, right? The process by which civil society converts narrow self-interest into a public-spirited virtue. I mean, that, in other words, in his understanding of civil society, there isn't that clear and radical distinction between private benefit and public, because he assumed that, of course, we're going to be focused on private benefit in America, given materialism, democracy, and so forth. And the trick would be to establish institutions that would somehow make all of that serve the public good. As I say, Tocqueville is appropriate for every occasion. Yes, please.
Well, thank you all. My name's Larry Ottinger. I used to run a group called Center for Lobbying the Public Interest, which is now mostly a part of National Council of Nonprofits, and Tim Delaney runs. And my question goes towards not only lobbying, but general, the voice of nonprofits, that I think regardless of whether it's pluralist or civil society is really important, we really need this independent sector voice. What your all's thoughts are on the democracy side of liberal democracy and of the role of civil society in that. I think there is a real opportunity with tax reform now on the table to at least rationalize some of the rules, make it simpler to lobby. I don't think lobbying is a private benefit by definition, nor other forms of nonpartisan civic engagement. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about the voice of nonprofits.
Good. Yeah, please.
I'll take a stab at that one. So I think you're right. I think the lobbying rules are kind of interesting. Lobbying is defined, the kind of lobbying that's prohibited or that's limited in nonprofits is pretty narrowly defined. There's direct lobbying where you're actually meeting with a member of a legislative body about a legislative proposal. And then there's grassroots lobbying where you encourage with a call to action to a legislator with respect to a legislative proposal. And then what is not lobbying is actually something that we all think of as lobbying. It's quite interesting, and charities are allowed to do as much of this as they like, and it's basically what we call issue advocacy, right? If it's educational, you're allowed to do it. You can educate the heck out of people on an issue that you think is important, and that's unlimited. And okay, so what's interesting is, you want to distinguish lobbying activity that generates private benefit from lobbying activity that generates public benefit. And so I think the tax law sort of gropes toward this result. I agree that the rules could be clarified and probably understood a little better, but issue advocacy perhaps is a category of lobbying that confers more public benefit than private benefit, and direct lobbying with a call to action, grassroots lobbying, perhaps confers more private benefit. But I'd agree that those two hard lobbying categories maybe could be broken down in a way. If you can think of a good rule to do that, I'd encourage you.
Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
I'll just say one quick thing about that too. one of the things which seems to me true is that the more and more one believes that civil society organizations, nonprofits, are a supplementary arm of the government to deliver services in partnership with or independent of, but nevertheless following out government-sanctioned aims, the less attractive the civil society democratic grassroots voice becomes as the image and, in fact, perhaps purpose of civil society. The more we have recourse to that image of civil society as an ever-evolving contestatory arena of associations which people join or leave at their will as a product of the individual liberties they possess to exercise speech, to associate with others as they wish, then permission to speak politically in association with others appears much more attractive, and the less appealing these lobbying restrictions turn out to be.
I should say one of the things that I particularly appreciated about Alex's article was the fact that when conservatives talk about civil society, typically they tend to talk more about services, delivery of goods and services of various sorts to the public. Alex's piece makes the case for democratic engagement and civic engagement and the voice of the people, which typically is an argument that folks like Larry Ottinger make on the left, but it's nice to see an article making that argument on the conservative side. Yes, more questions. We have time really for, why don't we go to Ben here? Ben is working on, I should say, gives me an opportunity to put in a plug. Ben is working on a monograph for the Bradley Center here on this distinction between charity and philanthropy. It's as Stan pointed out, it is the fundamental distinction that sort of got institutional philanthropy underway, and we have forgotten the fact that there is an argument to be made for charity against philanthropy, and it's never made. You never see it. Ben will soon have a monograph. It will be the place to go for that debate.
Coming
now,
soon to
no
theaters
pressure,
near you.
But
So I want to put on a historian's hat for a second. I want to actually push Stan's comment even further. The neutrality of government towards the nonprofit sector might be a lofty ideal, but it's an entirely a fictive one, not just in the post-60s era, but in the entire scope of American history. In the 19th century, there was a robust relationship between government and nonprofits through the extension of charters, through direct subsidies given to social service organizations. And the other side, you had the sort of politicization of individuals channeled through nonprofits and extended towards government. And so I think I would push, if one invokes that ideal, I think it's convenient to look at it as starting post-60s, that the ideal was somehow threatened or undermined. But I think that's a sort of a useful and expedient starting point for political reasons. But I don't think it's fair to start there. I think one has to accept that the sort of realms of civil society were deeply penetrated by the public sector, and that's actually something inherent to the system that we inhabit now. And I think I agree with Stan. I think it's actually a virtue of our system, but the myth, I think, is actually more harmful than the reality in that situation.
The myth that there was
the myth that there was a golden age in which there was a sort of there were clear separate spheres, clear neutral spheres,
right,
and that somehow over time that's been eroded. I think it's very hard to pinpoint an era in American history where that was actually a fact. So that's not a question,
yeah,
but I'll throw it out.
Well, just a quick comment on that. I really support partnerships between civil society and government. It's the control. Everything should be arm's length. People should be able to make deals as autonomous agents, and that's absolutely fine. It's just when you have the inability to make an arm's length transaction because there's undue influence in the form of control that there's a problem.
And also, if I may, isn't American history built on a fiction, right? I mean, it isn't simply built on an accumulation of historical events from the past. It is, in fact, built on fictions like, for instance, John Locke's conviction that property precedes government, right? I mean, unlike Rob's point that property depends on government, our founders read people that said things like, no, government is secondary to the defense of property. That's why it was established. We have no time left, but let me just, Rob and Stan and Alex, if you have any final comments. This is your last chance.
Let's see. I hadn't thought of one just yet. So.
Okay, so Stan and Rob?
I mean, obviously what Ben says, I agree with. But go back to what Alex said. I really disagree with the last thing you said. I think the greatest thing about our society is that we're not at arm's length. And the essence of democracy is that we mix it up all the time. And I think I don't fear government. I don't fear the private sector. I think that a robust society wants the most open and sinuous set of relationships we can get. And I think it's unfortunate to conceptualize it in that way. It frequently doesn't work properly, but the answer is to make it work better.
I guess if I tried to capture what I believe is the difference between the framework I favor and tried to defend and the one that Alex did, it would come down to something like the following. I believe as ardently as I think Alex and Stan do in the significance of a flourishing and independent associational life, let's call it civil society. I think the absolutely necessary infrastructure for civil society to flourish is a robust protection of individual liberties, and that considerations of taxation are outside of the argument that gives you the conclusion that we ought to protect individual liberties for speech and association. Alex seems to think that if we are taxed, it is a necessary intrusion into individual liberty. I reject that. I think that has to be wrong because the tax system itself, whichever one you happen to prefer, is going to be the product of some democratic social contract. I'm willing to stipulate, for your own sake, choose the one you prefer, but don't confuse the argument on behalf of individual liberty with the argument for whatever tax system you wish for.
So my response to that, and the reason I hesitated before was because I was thinking about your comments about Lockean property rights, and the idea there is that that property rights are God-given, and you just have them before the state, and so those rights would be a way of pushing back against, say, the 16th Amendment, which imposes an income tax, right? You would, if you were a robust Lockean property rights theorist, you would reject that. You'd say the government doesn't have the power to take my property through imposing an income tax. I don't think you have to go that far. I think that you play the cards that you're dealt, and we have the 16th Amendment, we have an income tax, and the question is, how do we contextualize, how do we understand the relationship of government and civil society given an income tax? And the arguments that I'm making are based on the economics and tax law that has grown up around trying to implement an income tax that's supposed to measure economic income. So I'll leave it there.
Let's thank our panel for a terrific conversation.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Thank you, too.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Bill. Yeah, I just want to introduce myself. Nice to meet you. Very nice to meet you. Yeah, I have a copy of your book.